Hi and welcome. If you're listening to this at night, I hope it helps you unwind. Please like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? It's so nice to think that wherever we are, we're sharing this moment together. In the stillness of a long-forgotten winter, sometime in the early 14th century, a small wooden village slept beneath a blanket of snow. The sky had turned a pale grey by late afternoon, and the frost deepened with every passing hour. Chickens huddled beneath thatched eaves. Oxen stood steaming in the cold air, their breaths rising like gentle ghosts. Inside one of the cottages, little more than 4 walls, a roof and a hearth, a small family gathered near a flickering fire. The candlelight was weak and yellow, trembling in the draught that crept under the door. A pot of turnip soup bubbled softly, its scent mixing with the faint smoke curling from the hearthstones. There were no panes of glass to seal the world out, just oiled parchment stretched across narrow windows. The wind whispered through the gaps in the beams. At night, frost would creep silently across the floorboards, icing the edges of rough woolen boots. The winter had come early that year. The harvest was poor. Barley had rotted in the fields after weeks of cold rain, and apples had frozen on the branch. No one in the village spoke of it, but everyone knew what that meant. Less bread, fewer stores, and long months ahead. Beyond the village, the woods stood black and silent. Not even the birds called. Branches clutched at the sky like frozen fingers, and the snow on the path was unbroken except for the deep ruts of a cart, long since gone. Still, in that tiny room, the children huddled beneath blankets sewn from scraps of old wool. Their breath puffed into the air like mist. Their grandmother sang them a quiet song, not quite a lullaby, but something older, a song she had learned as a girl in another time, in another winter. The song faded into silence, the fire crackled softly, and the wind curled around the eaves like a watchful spirit, waiting. Just waiting. Morning came slowly. Pale light filtered through the stretched parchment windows, muted and grey, like the underside of a dove's wing. The hearth had burned low in the night, and a layer of fine ash dusted the logs. The cottage felt even colder than the evening before. Outside, the snow had thickened. It lay on the thatched roofs like icing on stale bread, soft and silent. Icicles clung to the eaves, long and clear as glass daggers. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, barely rising before sinking back toward the rooftops, as if even the smoke were too tired to climb. The village stirred one household at a time. A dog barked briefly, then fell quiet. Somewhere nearby, a wooden door creaked open and boots crunched on the frozen path. The baker's boy, wrapped in a patched cloak far too large for him, walked carefully toward the center of the village. A basket dangled from one arm. He was hoping for flour. Food was always first on the mind. In winter, everything became about hunger. Bread was thinner, ale was weaker, and meat, when it came, was usually salted beyond recognition. Those who had dried apples or onions from the fall kept them close, trading them in secret or saving them for feast days. In the central square, a small wooden trough had frozen into a solid block. The well nearby gave only the coldest water, drawn up in heavy iron buckets that stung the hands. The sound of the rope creaking over the pulley echoed faintly through the snow-draped stillness. Back in the cottage, the father stirred the embers and added a few slivers of wood. The fire hissed, then popped, slowly remembering how to burn. His wife unfolded a cloth bundle that held the last of their black bread. It was hard and dry, but dipped in hot water, it softened enough to chew. The children played quietly with bits of carved wood, their laughter muffled under the low ceiling. They wore mittens made from old wool socks and cloaks passed down from cousins long grown. Their cheeks were pink with cold, and their noses ran constantly, but no one complained. Complaining wasted breath. Outside, the wind picked up, sending tiny flurries swirling through the air. The flakes danced for a moment, then settled among the drifts. Everything was white. The barns, the fences, the trees, the fields, all swallowed in silence. And still, the people endured, not with joy, not with ease, but with the quiet resolve that came from knowing that winter always ended, eventually. The snow would melt, the birds would return, but not yet. Tonight would be colder. By the third week of frost, every sound in the village had grown softer. Even the hammering of the blacksmith seemed muted beneath the weight of the snow. The cold dulled the clang of iron and turned voices into whispers that vanished quickly into the thick air. People wore as many layers as they could. Wool over linen, cloaks over tunics, furs around the neck when they were lucky. Beneath it all, their skin itched and chafed, but they dared not remove anything. Warmth was more precious than comfort. It was guarded, hoarded like silver. In one cottage, an old widow named Ida wrapped her hands in a scarf before attempting to light her fire. Her joints ached from the damp, but she moved carefully, striking the flint against her knife until the spark caught the dry moss. She cupped it with shaking hands, breathing on it gently until it grew. She lived alone since the fever had taken her son 2 winters before. Her voice hadn't been heard much since, but she still lit her fire, still baked her rye cakes when she could. Her windows were smudged and her chimney leaned slightly, but she remained, a quiet pillar in a quiet world. Elsewhere, the children of the village played near the frozen pond, their feet wrapped in cloth beneath their boots to keep out the chill. They dared one another to slide across the ice, their laughter brief and bright against the stillness. One of them carried a stick, pretending it was a sword, but there were no battles here, only frost and games. Inside the chapel, a single candle burned beside a wooden altar. The priest had rubbed wax into his shoes to keep them from cracking in the cold. His breath steamed in the still air as he murmured morning prayers. The walls were stone, the roof slate, and the cold lived in them both. Above all this, the sky hung pale and still. No sun, just a brightness that hurt the eyes and gave no warmth. The trees stood rimed with ice, each branch outlined in crystal. The fields beyond were frozen solid, their furrows hidden beneath the snow. No birds stirred, and even the crows had gone quiet. The days passed slowly. Light came late and left early. Each morning was a struggle to find warmth, and each night was spent listening to the creaks and groans of timbers settling in the cold. And yet, beneath it all, life continued. Fires were lit, bread was baked, water was drawn. The rhythm of survival, slow and quiet, echoed softly through the village, like a heartbeat in winter. The cold had begun to settle into the bones of the village. It wasn't just in the air or the snow. It lived in the wood of the doors, in the stone of the hearths, in the very marrow of the people who walked its paths. Even the youngest children began to move more slowly, as though their limbs had turned to iron. Old men sat by their fires, their hands wrapped in cloth, their knees covered in wool. They spoke little, and when they did, it was with a kind of quiet resignation. Winter was no stranger. It came every year, like a guest that no one invited and no one dared ask to leave. In the loft of the barn, a cow lowed softly. Her breath rose in warm clouds. She was one of the few left. her sisters having been sold or slaughtered when feed ran low. The boy who tended her came twice each day, his fingers red and cracked from the cold, a wooden pail clutched in his arms. He spoke to her gently as he worked, humming tunelessly, the sound of it lost in the heavy stillness. She was his secret comfort, not just for the milk she gave, but for the warmth of her presence, the solid shape of her in the gloom. In a nearby home, a woman crushed dried herbs between two stones, her hands nimble despite the chill. She was the healer, the one they came to for coughs and fevers. Her hut smelled of dried rosemary and sage, and the thick smoke of peat. She wrapped her mixtures in cloth and tied them with string, placing them carefully on shelves carved from a single oak beam. The sick came rarely in winter. Most stayed indoors, their ailments growing quietly in the dark. But when they came quietly, wrapped in shawls, their breath rasping in the still air. She would give them what she could, and say what words she thought might help. The cold made time feel longer. Each hour stretched out like a ribbon of ice. Meals were small and slow. Each bite savoured more from necessity than pleasure. The crackle of firewood, the hush of snow slipping from a roof, the distant call of a shepherd. These became the day's music, and always the sky loomed above, low and colourless. It promised nothing, not sun, not warmth, only more grey, more waiting. Yet, there was a kind of beauty to it, a silence that felt sacred, a stillness that asked nothing, expected nothing, just to be endured. And in the enduring, life continued, small and cold, but steady, like a candle flame refusing to go out. Beyond the edge of the village, past the frozen stream and the snow-laden hedgerows, the forest stood in perfect silence. Its trees were tall and bare, their branches silvered with frost, like the ribs of some ancient sleeping beast. No birds called here, no animals stirred. The only sound was the occasional creak of a limb under snow's weight. This was not a forest for wandering in winter. Even the boldest hunters hesitated to step beneath its boughs once the frost came. Paths were lost too easily. Snow covered the tracks, and the woods, once full of life in summer, became something else in the cold. Still, there were times when a trip was needed. A young man named Halric had gone that morning, his cloak pulled tight, his axe slung across his back. His family had burned the last of their firewood the night before. The walls of their cottage had gone cold by dawn, and his mother's cough had grown worse. He had not wanted to leave her, but the forest was the only place left to find warmth. He moved slowly among the trees, following a trail he had used since childhood. The snow here was deeper. It muffled his steps, and his breath fogged in front of him like a cloud. Frost clung to his beard, and the wool of his mittens had frozen stiff. He found a fallen tree after some time, its trunk snapped near the base, bark stripped clean by weather. He knelt beside it and began to chop, the sound of his axe echoing softly between the trees. With each swing, a little heat returned to his limbs. He paused often, listening, but there was nothing. The forest gave him just enough. A small pile of wood, enough to last through the next 2 nights. He bundled it tightly and slung it over his back, moving carefully along the path he had carved for himself through the snow. The way home felt longer than before. The wind had picked up, tugging at his cloak and slipping ice into the folds. But at last, the edge of the trees came into view, and beyond them, the soft curls of smoke rising from the village rooftops. The sight filled him with a quiet relief. Not joy, not excitement, just the comfort of knowing he would return, that the fire would burn again tonight. And in the cottage, as his mother dozed beside the hearth, the children would smile when the door creaked open and the warmth would rise slowly again from the embers. All because of a quiet walk through a silent forest. In the centre of the village stood the chapel, its wooden steeple crowned with a small iron bell. It rang only twice each day in winter, once at dawn, once at dusk, and even then the sound was soft, swallowed quickly by the heavy air. But it was enough to mark the passing of time, to remind the villagers that day still followed night. The priest was an old man named Father Aldwin, hunched by years and wrapped in woolen robes. His fingers were always tucked into his sleeves, and his nose was red with cold, but his voice remained steady and low, like the rustle of dry leaves. Each morning, before the bell, he would step into the chapel's narrow nave and light 3 candles near the altar. The light was soft, gold on grey stone, flickering gently against the wooden beams above. He would whisper his prayers alone, the breath of his voice barely disturbing the stillness. Sometimes, a villager or two would come and kneel in silence behind him. They never spoke. Only the creak of the old pews betrayed their presence. The chapel was not grand. Its windows were simple, its walls damp with the season's chill. A small bowl of frozen holy water stood near the door. Icicles sometimes formed along the sill, where wind found its way through the cracks. But the quiet of the place made it holy in a different way. A kind of peace that had nothing to do with ceremony. Outside, the snow drifted slowly. A path had been cleared from the village square to the chapel door, but it filled quickly with each new flurry. Children sometimes followed it after chores, their feet crunching on the packed ice, their cheeks red with cold. Inside, the pews grew colder with every hour, but the flickering candles and the hush of prayer gave the space a warmth no fire could match. And when Father Aldwin stood to ring the evening bell, he did so with a slow, deliberate rhythm, not to summon, but to soothe. The bell's voice drifted across the rooftops, over the frost-rimed fences, and down the lanes dusted in snow. It reached the cottages like a sigh, a soft reminder that another day had ended, and that night was upon them once more. And in that sound, the village found a kind of comfort. The world outside might be bitter and still, but the chapel bell rang just as it always had, gentle, low, familiar, like the heartbeat of the village. Evening in the village arrived not with a sunset, but with a slow deepening of the grey, the sky dimmed by small degrees until the outlines of trees and rooftops began to blur. Smoke hung heavier over the chimneys, and lights began to glow behind oiled parchment. Inside each home, candles were lit with care. They were precious, made from tallow or beeswax, often moulded by hand. Some were short and squat, others thin and uneven, but all burned with a steady golden flame. Their light cast long shadows across stone walls and clay floors, flickering gently as people moved around the hearth. Dinner was a quiet affair. A pot suspended over the fire, its contents modest, sometimes broth with barley, or stew with bits of root vegetable and the occasional shred of salted meat. Wooden spoons clinked softly against clay bowls. No one hurried. Each bite was slow, mindful, and warm. At the edge of the hearth, flat stones held the day's bread close to the fire. It was hard from the cold, but softened slightly with heat. A bit of butter, if there was any left, would be spread sparingly. Often it was just the steam that made the bread feel softer than it truly was. Children sat cross-legged beneath thick woolen blankets, eating with pink hands and wide eyes. Their games were packed away. Their voices were quieter now. The hush of evening had settled in. Outside, the snow continued to fall in small, delicate flakes. No wind, no noise, just the steady rhythm of winter. Some homes kept herbs hanging from the rafters: lavender, thyme, rosemary, remnants from the last growing season. Their scent had faded but lingered faintly when warmed by the fire. In one cottage, a grandmother crushed dried mint into a basin of hot water, releasing a sharp, comforting scent into the air. It was for her grandson's cough. He breathed it in with eyes closed, soothed by the warmth. Later, bowls would be rinsed with melted snow. The fire would be fed once more. Then cloaks and blankets would be layered over straw mattresses, and families would lie close together, sharing heat like embers beneath ash. Before sleep, a father might murmur a tale, a story of a brave knight or a clever fox. Nothing too grand, just enough to carry the children gently into dreams. And above it all, the candlelight flickered softly until the wick finally burned low and sleep settled like snow on the rooftops. By the middle of winter, the frost had become a familiar presence, not just in the air or the snow, but in every crevice of village life. It crept along the windows overnight, weaving delicate patterns on the stretched parchment. When morning light struck just right, the frost bloomed into feathers and stars, cold and beautiful. Children sometimes traced the shapes with their fingertips, marveling at the way the designs faded beneath their touch. The warmth of a hand was enough to melt the delicate artwork, leaving behind nothing but a smudge of moisture. In one quiet home near the edge of the village, a young woman named Lena stood watching the frost from her narrow window. She held a cup of hot water steeped with dried rose hips, the warmth of it rising to her face like a soft mist. Her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, and her breath steamed faintly in the pale light. She had been born in this cottage, her life shaped by the same walls and timbers. The winters had always been harsh, but this one felt longer, the days shorter, the fire harder to keep alive. She thought of her mother, who used to hum softly while spinning wool. That hum had kept the cold at bay as much as any fire. Now it was Lene who spun the wool. She sat each day at the small wheel by the hearth, her fingers moving slowly, methodically, creating thread from the fleece gathered in better months. The sound of the spinning was a quiet one, a soft whir, like a whisper behind the crackle of the fire. Sometimes she sang, softly and without words, just a tune she carried from memory, as ancient as the frost on the window. Outside, the world remained silent. No carts rolled down the lane. No bells rang out beyond the chapel. The snow had settled deep and even across the fields, covering fence posts and haystacks, cloaking everything in stillness. A crow passed overhead, black against the grey sky, its wings cutting the quiet like a single brush stroke. Then it was gone, and the hush returned. In that hush, Lena sipped her tea. The heat seeped through her chest, calming and slow. The fire beside her burned low but steady, casting a pool of soft orange light on the wooden floor. The frost on the window remained untouched. It would be days before the sun returned in earnest, but for now there was warmth enough in the cup, and the fire, and the slow rhythm of spinning wool beside the frost-laced glass. By late winter, the snow no longer felt soft. Its surface had hardened, glazed by nights of deep frost. When walked upon, it crunched like brittle sugar, each step leaving a shallow dent before snapping back into stillness. The rooftops of the village bore the weight of many days' snowfall. Thatched eaves sagged slightly, and here and there, villagers climbed ladders with cautious movements, sweeping snow from the edges to keep their homes from collapsing under the strain. The work was slow, done with wooden shovels and bent backs, breath rising in clouds. One man, Joran the Thatcher, moved from roof to roof with quiet determination. His gloved hands were thick with old leather, patched in places. He had done this for 30 winters and knew the sound of a roof in distress, the subtle creak, the low groan of beams under too much pressure. Each sound told a story. Each story needed tending. His ladder creaked softly against the side of the baker's house, and as he climbed, the cold bit through the wool at his wrists. From the top, the village looked hushed and pale. Only the curling smoke gave life to the view. Grey ribbons dancing slowly into the clouds. Below, children followed in his footsteps, helping gather the snow into piles where it could melt slowly under the midday light, weak though it was. Their laughter, even muffled by scarves, brought a flicker of warmth to the scene. Back in the cottages, those too old or frail to work watched from small windows. They warmed their hands by the fire and stirred thin stews with carved wooden spoons, their thoughts drifting between seasons, between years. They had seen winters worse than this, and some not as harsh, but all carried the same quiet burden. Every inch of snow was a weight, not just on the roofs, but on the spirit. It pressed down slowly, day by day, a quiet pressure. It made the fire feel smaller, the nights feel longer. Even dreams took on the hush of white fields. But under the snow, the earth still waited. Beneath the frozen soil, seeds slept in darkness. They had no warmth, no light, but they waited all the same, just as the people did, not in haste, not in despair, but in patience, because snow, for all its weight, must one day melt. And when it did, the village would breathe again. Until then, they endured, wrapped in wool, lit by candles, moving gently beneath the weight of winter. In fair weather, the village square became a place of exchange. Farmers brought sacks of grain, weavers displayed rolls of cloth, and traders from other hamlets arrived with carts pulled by tired ponies. But in the heart of winter, the market stood empty, hushed beneath a soft blanket of snow. Stalls that once held cheeses and dried fish were shuttered with boards. Wooden tables leaned under the weight of icicles. The cart paths that had once been rutted with wheels and boots were now smooth and white, marked only by the occasional footprint or stray chicken. Still, each week on the same day, a few souls came to the square out of habit more than hope. They wandered between the silent stalls, eyes scanning the doorways, scarves wrapped tight against the wind. No one expected to find much. Perhaps a bundle of dried nettles, a scrap of linen, a bit of lard, if someone had extra. This morning, a man named Tomer had come early, his boots wrapped in burlap to keep out the cold. His breath rose steadily as he paced, carrying a small pouch with 2 silver buttons, the last of his wife's wedding dress. He was hoping to trade them for flour, enough for bread, at least for a few more days. Across the square, an old woman named Bruna stood beside a makeshift bench, her basket filled with dried mushrooms and wild garlic gathered in the fall. She hadn't expected anyone, but when she saw Tomer approach, she smiled with a nod. No words passed between them, just the quiet placing of the pouch, the selection of a few handfuls, and the gentle tightening of her shawl. It was enough. Nearby, a small girl stood watching them. She held a handful of twigs, gathered for kindling, and kicked gently at a patch of frozen mud. Her dog sat at her feet, shivering slightly but loyal, his ears perked toward the sound of voices. As the morning wore on, a few others arrived carrying small things, a carved comb, a length of thread, a jar of thickened honey. Trades were made in silence or with murmured thanks, and slowly the square found life, not bustling, not bright, but alive. A boy passed through leading a goat with a woven rope. A woman paused to share a strip of dried pear with a neighbour. A man with frost in his beard laughed softly at something his friend had said. The sound, rare and fragile, lingered in the cold air like steam. By noon, the square was empty once more, but the quiet felt gentler. The wind had eased and the snow had begun to fall again, light and slow. The market had offered little, yet it gave something far greater than goods. It reminded them that they were not alone. At night, the village grew quieter still. Fires dimmed, candles guttered, and the muffled hush of snow deepened. Only the faintest glow slipped from beneath cottage doors, and even that faded as sleep came to those within. In the loft of a small home near the village edge, a family of 4 lay together beneath a pile of blankets, furs, and straw-stuffed mattresses. The beams above their heads creaked softly in the cold, their rough wood lined with cobwebs that trembled in the draught. The youngest child, a boy of 6 winters, stirred in his sleep. His breath came slowly, gently, rising in small clouds that vanished into the rafters. He dreamed of green hills, of running barefoot through grass, of honey-sweet berries and warm sun on his face. Dreams had become like food, rare, needed, precious. Beside him, his sister murmured softly. She dreamed of horses with silver manes, of bells ringing on bright mornings, of the first apple blossoms opening like stars. Her hands, curled beneath her chin, clutched a bit of worn cloth, once a doll's dress, now a comfort of its own. Their mother lay wakeful, her eyes open to the dark. She listened to their breathing, to the wind slipping past the shuttered window, to the quiet shift of the fire's last embers. Her thoughts drifted through the day, the soup that had lasted longer than expected, the neighbour who had shared a heel of cheese, the snow that would need sweeping again. She did not worry aloud. Winter had taught her silence, but in her stillness there was strength. Below, the hearthstone glowed faintly. A few logs remained, their heat steady but low. A kettle of water left to catch what warmth it could, steamed just a little, not boiling but warm enough to offer comfort come morning. A cat, thin but clever, curled near the base of the fire. It blinked once, then tucked its nose beneath its paw. It had caught a mouse that day, and now it dreamed of fields as well. Outside, the snow fell again. Software relentless. It clung to the shutters, the fence posts, the sloping roof. It buried the village in silence. And inside, beneath the rafters and behind the thick door, dreams moved slowly from one sleeper to the next. Not grand dreams, just gentle ones, the kind that waited all day to arrive and left before dawn, quiet and unannounced. The kind that made even the coldest night feel less alone. Morning crept in quietly. The frost still lay thick on the window ledges, but inside, the cottage had begun to stir. A soft crackle rose from the hearth as kindling caught flame. The scent of smoke, tinged with a trace of yesterday's soup, filled the air. Warm, earthy, familiar. In the baker's home, a fire had been lit long before dawn. He worked silently, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. The oven, made of clay and stone, radiated a steady heat that filled the small room with welcome warmth. The first dough of the day rested in a wooden bowl, rising slowly under a cloth. The smell of baking bread began as a whisper. Then it deepened, filling the air with richness and memory. It seeped through the shutters, across the frost-cracked sills, and into the neighbouring homes, where sleepy heads turned and mouths watered. This bread would not be soft nor sweet. It was made of coarse barley, with just a pinch of rye, but in winter it was a treasure. A slice, dark and dense, could lift spirits more than any tale or tune. As the bread baked, the baker moved about with practiced grace. He checked the embers, added sticks to the fire, and opened the wooden shutters just enough to let the steam escape. The cold bit instantly at his face, but he smiled. It would make the crust firmer. A boy knocked at the door, the blacksmith's son, holding a pouch of dried peas and a promise of labour. The baker nodded and gave him a half loaf, still warm. The boy held it in both hands as he walked home, the crust warming his fingers, the smell chasing away the cold for a few moments. Outside, the snow had paused. For the first time in days, the sky held a hint of blue, thin and watery, like ink in snowmelt. Icicles shimmered on rooftops, dripping slowly, steadily. By midday, the scent of ash and bread had drifted through the entire village. People emerged from their homes, blinking against the light, speaking softly as if afraid to disturb the peace. A small girl with a chipped bowl received a crust from the baker's wife, who tucked it into her scarf and patted her gently on the head. No words were needed. The gesture was enough. And in that simple act, the warmth of bread, the sharing of hunger, the kindness without asking, winter loosened its grip just slightly. Just enough for hope to rise again, like dough beside the fire. At the edge of the frozen stream, where the trees gave way to scrub and slope, stood the village's old mill. Its water wheel, once steady and sure, had long since stopped turning, frozen in place by weeks of ice. The wooden paddles were crusted with frost, and icicles dangled from the mill race like tiny glass knives. Few came here in winter. The mill had not ground grain since the first snow, when the stream slowed to a crawl and then stiffened completely. But today, a small figure trudged up the bank. It was Elric, the tanner's apprentice, carrying a sack of husks on his shoulder. He was not here for grinding. He was here for quiet. The mill, though still and cold, held a certain peace. Its stone walls were thick, sheltering against the wind. The inside smelled faintly of flour and old wood. Mice rustled softly beneath the floorboards, and dust sparkled in the weak daylight slipping through the broken shutter. Elric set down his sack and leaned against the doorframe, exhaling slowly. The stillness of the place felt heavier than silence, like the memory of motion paused. He had always liked the mill. In warmer months, he would skip stones across the stream and listen to the wheel creak with each turn. Now, the world around it was so still that even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He walked the perimeter, boots crunching softly, hands tucked deep in his sleeves. He picked up a frost-covered twig, turned it in his fingers and dropped it again. Nearby, a small bird fluttered from one branch to another, the first he had seen in days. Inside, an old blanket still lay tucked in the corner, left by the miller's son before he moved away last year. Elric sat there for a while, resting his back against the cool wall, watching the beams above shift gently with the settling of the structure. A single sunbeam pierced the gloom, catching on the floating dust and warming the top of his knee. He didn't stay long. Just long enough to let the quiet sink into his bones, to remind himself that the world, for all its cold, was still turning. When he rose, he left the sack behind, not as an offering, but as a placeholder, a promise that the mill would grind again once the ice let go. The path back to the village was narrow and slick, but he knew it well. and when he reached home, cheeks flushed and fingers numb, his master asked nothing, just handed him a bowl of hot broth and nodded once. In the mill's silence, Elric had found a kind of warmth, not in the fire, but in the stillness. It happened slowly, and almost no one noticed at first. A drip, then another. The icicles that clung to the chapel's eaves began to glisten differently, catching the light not with the stillness of frost, but with the trembling sheen of water, as if the ice itself had begun to weep. The village had lived under snow for weeks, perhaps months. Time blurred when days were short and nights long. But this day was different, if only by a breath. The air carried something new, something gentler. Not warmth, not yet, but the memory of it. A droplet slipped from the end of a frozen branch and fell, soundless, into the snow below. A curl of smoke from the baker's chimney rose higher than before. The frost on the windows thinned at the corners. The snow on the road had a slight sheen, as if it were not quite sure whether to remain solid. In one cottage, a girl noticed the floor near the door was damp. She fetched a cloth and knelt, wiping the wooden planks with careful hands. She paused when she saw the trail led from a dark spot on the ceiling beam. It was the first melt, just a few drops, but it meant the ice was loosening its grip. By the stream, cracks formed in the thick ice. Hairline fractures, barely visible, traced the surface like ancient writing. A single feather floated there, white against the glassy grey. The water beneath remained still, but it stirred faintly like a dream half remembered. The villagers felt it in their bones, the way their cloaks moved more freely, the way the air touched their skin with a softness not felt in weeks. It was not spring, not yet, but the season had shifted. That evening, when the chapel bell rang, its sound carried just a little farther. The air did not swallow it so quickly. A child heard it from within the barn and smiled without knowing why. Inside, fires were still lit, blankets still drawn tight, but people leaned a little closer to the window. They lingered at the door just a moment longer, breathing in the cool air, as if testing a thought they had not dared to speak. Outside, the icicles dripped steadily, one by one, tracing tiny paths down the stone and wood. The village listened, and winter, for all its silence, answered softly with water. By the end of that week, the snow had changed. It no longer crunched sharply underfoot. It sank slightly with each step, becoming heavy and wet. The air tasted different, still cold, but no longer biting. There was a quiet softness to everything, as though the world had taken a deep breath after holding it all winter long. The path that wound between the cottages and down toward the stream grew darker, its surface muddied with melt. Children pressed their boots into the softened ground, delighted by the squelch of it. A tiny trickle ran beside the stones, following the curve of the hill, the first running water they'd seen in months. At the stream's edge, a boy and his older sister watched the ice shift. It groaned softly, as though stirring from a deep sleep. Cracks widened with the slow movement of water beneath. The sister touched her brother's shoulder, then pointed. A patch of clear water had opened near the bank, just a small circle, but enough to show the current, slow and sure. In the village, smoke rose from the chimneys in thinner strands. Fires were still needed, but they burned less fiercely now. Wood was used more sparingly, and the scent of damp earth began to mingle with that of ash. Doors opened for longer. Some windows were cracked, if only for a moment. In the square, someone laughed. It was not loud nor long, but it was the kind of sound that had been missing. the kind that brought others to their doors just to hear it. The chapel bell rang as always, but today it was followed by the gentle ringing of a small handbell, the kind used in festival games or calls to mealtime. No one knew who rang it, but no one minded. Near the edge of the forest, the first buds had appeared, pale green, curled tightly against the branch, a promise not yet fulfilled, but undeniable. Inside the cottages, blankets were aired, floors were swept with new energy. Bread was baked with a touch more salt, and laughter returned, not loud, but present. Eyes looked toward the horizon, imagining fields softening under the sun. The villagers had not forgotten the cold. It still lay in the corners of their homes, in the aches of old bones, in the careful way they moved. But now there was something more. A thaw, a sound, a smile, a change. And in this quiet shift, this small opening of the world, winter's long shadow began to slip away. Thanks for watching this far. I truly appreciate you more than you know. If you like this story, please like and subscribe.